Let her die. My father said it like he was refusing another cup of coffee. I was 31 years old, lying in a hospital bed with an internal hemorrhage, barely conscious enough to understand the doctor standing beside my parents. She's stable right now, the doctor said, but if the bleeding worsens overnight, we may need emergency surgery. I strongly recommend someone remain available. Through half-open eyes, I saw my mother, Deanne, look at my father. Dad checked his watch. We've already done enough, he said. If she gets worse, let her die. Mr. Bennett. We're leaving. Mom picked up her purse. She didn't argue. She didn't come to my bedside. She simply followed him toward the door. I tried to say, Mom. Nothing came out. The door clicked shut. And for the first time, I understood exactly how little my life mattered when compared with what my family wanted from me. But 7 days later, those same people would walk back into my hospital room, and suddenly they would care very much about whether I was alive. The next morning, I woke properly to sunlight cutting through the blinds. A nurse was checking my IV. My parents. Her hands paused. Are they outside? She looked uncomfortable. They left last night. I reached for my phone. No missed calls from Mom. None from Dad. Nothing from my younger brother, Ethan. For days, I heard nothing. I didn't call them either. As my condition stabilized, something else kept circling through my mind. 2 weeks before I landed in the hospital, Margaret Cole, the attorney handling my late grandmother Evelyn's estate, had called me. Pearl, has anyone in your family been helping you with your financial affairs? No, why? She'd hesitated. Someone has been asking questions about your inheritance. At the time, I'd assumed Dad was being intrusive again. Grandma had left most of her personal estate to me, and my parents had never accepted it. But now I kept hearing Dad's voice. Let her die. Exactly 1 week after my parents abandoned me, my hospital door opened. Dad walked in. Mom followed. Then Ethan. Not one of them hugged me. Not one asked how I felt. Dad dragged the visitor's chair beside my bed and sat down. We need to talk. About what? His eyes never left mine. We need to know what happened to Grandma's inheritance. My fingers tightened around the blanket. They hadn't contacted me for 7 days. They had walked away believing I might die. And now, all 3 of them were standing beside my hospital bed asking about money. The question wasn't why they'd finally returned. It was why my inheritance was the first thing they needed to know about. I didn't answer Dad. That seemed to bother him more than if I'd shouted. He leaned forward. Pearl, I asked you a question. I heard you. Mom stepped closer to my bed. Then answer him. We're trying to sort this out as a family. I almost laughed. A family. Ethan had always been the one my parents protected. When his first business failed, Dad covered the debt. When he maxed out 2 credit cards, Mom called it a difficult period. Every mistake Ethan made became something the family needed to solve. With me, competence had become a punishment. You're responsible, Pearl. You'll manage. Ethan needs more help than you do. 6 months earlier, when Grandma Evelyn died, she had left most of her personal estate to me. I'd been the one driving her to appointments, bringing groceries, and sitting beside her when she became too weak to leave home. Dad's reaction to her had been immediate. This isn't fair to Ethan. Mom spent weeks asking me to share voluntarily. But Grandma had told me privately, Pearl, I want what I leave behind controlled by someone I trust. So I'd refused. Now Ethan pulled his chair closer. Look, I'm trying to buy a house, he said. That money could actually do something useful. There's no point letting Grandma's money sit around. I stared at him. I'd nearly died. He was discussing property. Then Dad asked something that changed everything. Did you chain anything recently? Not how much did Grandma leave you? Not where is the money. Did you change anything? I slowly turned toward him. What exactly would I have changed? His jaw tightened. You know what I mean. No, Dad, I don't. Mom stepped in immediately. Pearl, you've been heavily medicated. You're twisting a perfectly normal question into something ugly. I watched Dad instead. How did you know there was anything I could change? Nobody answered. A minute later, Dad stood. We'll discuss this when you're thinking clearly. After they left, I locked the hospital door and called Margaret Cole. Margaret, I need you to tell me exactly who contacted your office about my inheritance. Silence. Then she said, your father. My stomach tightened. How many times? Twice. He claimed he was assisting you with future planning. We refused to disclose anything. Twice. Yes, Pearl, there's something else. My hand tightened around the phone. When was the second request? Instead of answering, Margaret said, I'm forwarding both communications to you now. My phone vibrated. I opened the email. There was Dad's name, his written request, and underneath it was the timestamp. It had been submitted while I was unconscious in the hospital. Several days after I was discharged, I walked into Margaret Cole's law office and found Ethan already sitting at the conference table. There were property listings in front of him. Actual house listings. Dad sat beside him, while Mom smiled at me as though we were there to negotiate something I'd already agreed to give away. Pearl, she said, good. Now we can settle this without all the drama. I took the chair beside Margaret. Dad tapped the papers. Ethan found a few reasonable properties. We just need to determine what portion of Grandma's inheritance. Richard, Margaret interrupted. Before anyone discusses Pearl's inheritance, I have a question. Dad stopped. Margaret folded her hands. Why did you contact my office while Pearl was hospitalized? Ethan looked up. Dad's face hardened. I was preparing for the worst. Margaret didn't blink. You specifically asked whether Pearl's assets would pass to you and Diane if Pearl died. The room went silent. Even Ethan stopped touching the listings. I stared at my father. You were investigating my money while I was unconscious. I was being responsible, Dad snapped. Parents have to think ahead. Then why did you leave the hospital? Mom shifted in her chair. I continued. The doctor asked you to remain available. You didn't even leave a number where they could reach you. Pearl, Mom said sharply, this isn't about the hospital anymore. Your grandmother created this situation by favoring you. There it was again. Grandma's decision was somehow my crime. Mom pointed toward Ethan. Your brother shouldn't suffer because Evelyn chose favorites. Ethan finally spoke. If something happened to you, I'd still get my share eventually, right? I turned toward him. My share, he'd said. Not asterisk an inheritance. Not asterisk something. My share. As though he'd already counted money that only became available if I wasn't there to own it. Margaret looked at me but said nothing. She didn't need to. Dad's questions while I was unconscious. Ethan's confidence. Mom's obsession with Grandma's decision. And 7 days of complete silence until they knew I'd survived. I stood. This meeting is over. Dad followed me into the hallway. Pearl. I kept walking. He caught up and lowered his voice so Margaret and Ethan couldn't hear. For the first time, Dad didn't sound angry. He sounded worried. Pearl, whatever you changed, you can still change it back. I stopped with my hand on the office door. Because Dad had just confirmed the one thing I hadn't told him. Something asterisk had asterisk been changed. And somehow, he already knew it mattered. I stopped answering their calls. Instead, I went back to Margaret's office alone. She spread Dad's 2 written inquiries across the conference table, beside the estate documents we'd already discussed. Let's put this in order, she said. The first request had come before my hospitalization. Dad wanted information about Grandma Evelyn's inheritance and claimed he was helping me with financial planning. The firm refused him. Then I was rushed to the hospital. While I was unconscious, he tried again. This time, his question was different. What happens to Pearl Bennett's assets if she dies? I stared at those words. Then something Margaret had explained during my earlier estate planning came back to me. My old documents. She nodded. Before we'd begun changing them, I was unmarried, had no children, and my existing arrangements could have allowed part of my estate to pass to my parents. Dad didn't need me to give him Grandma's inheritance. Under the old arrangement, he only needed me not to survive. I looked at Margaret. I'm not saying he caused what happened to me. There is absolutely no evidence of that, she said. I know. That wasn't the betrayal. My medical emergency had been sudden and unrelated to my family. Dad had simply seen an opportunity inside it. Finish the changes, I said. Margaret studied me. You're certain? Completely. My parents were removed from every beneficiary and decision-making position. So was Ethan. An independent professional would handle my affairs if I were ever incapacitated again. Margaret preserved Dad's communications so there could be no future confusion about what he'd attempted. Then I sent one message to my family. Come to my house Saturday. We will settle this once. They arrived expecting surrender. Dad began almost immediately. We should divide the inheritance in a way that's fair. Ethan nodded. I just need enough for the house. I let them talk. Then I placed a sealed envelope in the center of the table. Mom's eyes dropped to it. So you finally listened. She reached forward. I placed my hand over the envelope. Not yet. Dad stared at me. I looked directly at him. Before you open this, Dad, tell Ethan what you asked the lawyer while I was dying. Nobody moved. Dad stared at the envelope. What are you talking about? You know exactly what I'm talking about. Ethan looked between us. Dad. I kept my hand on the envelope. Before I went into the hospital, Dad contacted Margaret's office asking about Grandma's inheritance. They refused to give him information. Mom's face tightened. Pearl, we've already discussed. No, you discussed what you thought belonged to Ethan. I'm talking about what Dad did next. I turned toward my brother. While I was unconscious, Dad contacted Margaret's office again. This time, he didn't ask how much Grandma left me. Dad pushed his chair back. That was taken out of context. I ignored him. He asked what would happen to my assets if I died. Ethan's expression changed. What? Dad stood. I told you I was preparing for the worst. But the pieces finally fit together. Dad knew enough about my old estate arrangements to believe that because I was unmarried and had no children, part of my estate could eventually pass to my parents. He had already spent 6 months furious that Grandma Evelyn left most of her personal estate to me instead of Ethan. Then I unexpectedly became critically ill. And while I lay unconscious, Dad tried to find out what my death would mean financially. That was why he'd asked whether I'd changed anything. That was why he followed me from Margaret's office and told me I could change it back. And that was why my family disappeared when they thought I might die, only to return after learning I'd survived. Ethan slowly turned toward Dad. Is that why you told me not to visit her? Dad's mouth opened, but Mom answered first. Your father said there was nothing you could do. Her voice had lost its certainty. He said, if Pearl didn't make it, we needed to think practically about what happened afterward. Ethan stared at her. You knew. I didn't know everything. But you left with him. Mom looked at me. I finally said the one thing none of them knew. I heard you. Dad frowned. At the hospital, I wasn't fully conscious, but I heard the doctor ask you to stay. Mom's face went pale. I looked at Dad, and I heard your answer. His eyes shifted away. Let her die. Silence swallowed the room. Dad shook his head. Pearl, you misunderstood what I meant. I didn't argue. There was nothing left to argue about. I lifted my hand from the envelope. Open it. Mom pulled it toward herself. Inside were copies of Dad's inquiries to Margaret's office. Beneath them was confirmation that my estate documents had been updated. And beneath that was formal notice explaining that Richard Bennett, Diane Bennett, and Ethan Bennett had been removed from every beneficiary and decision-making position. Ethan read the page twice. So I get nothing. I looked at him. You were planning a house around money you'd receive if I wasn't alive to own it. He lowered the paper. Dad grabbed the documents. You can't seriously intend cut your entire family out. I already did. There was no secret beneficiary waiting to receive everything out of revenge. I hadn't given Grandma's inheritance away. I had simply protected it. Margaret formally instructed my family that any future questions concerning my estate had to go through her office. Dad's unauthorized inquiries were preserved in writing. An independent professional, not my parents, would handle my affairs if I were ever incapacitated again. Dad lost the financial leverage he thought he had. Ethan lost the inheritance he'd already begun treating as his future property. And Mom lost the thing she'd relied on for years, the certainty that eventually I would forgive them. When Dad later told relatives I'd cut the family off over money, the written timeline told a different story. People learned he'd been asking about my assets while I was unconscious. The version where he was the injured father didn't survive the facts. I stopped attending family gatherings. I stopped explaining my boundaries. Most importantly, I stopped waiting for my parents to value me the way they valued Ethan. Months later, my health had improved enough that the hospital felt like another lifetime. During a meeting, Margaret asked, "Do you want to reconsider any of the exclusions?" No. I didn't hesitate. Sometimes I still remembered waking in that hospital room and looking toward the empty chair beside my bed. For years, I'd wanted my parents to prove that when life became serious, they'd choose me too. That empty chair had finally answered the question. I kept Grandma Evelyn's inheritance exactly where she intended it to remain, protected, secure, and under my control. My parents had made their choice when they believed I was powerless. I made mine when I survived. They left me alone when they thought I might die, so I made sure my death would never reward them.